What do you say, Johan? Are we ready to start?
I think so.
Yeah? So let's get started then. Welcome everyone who's joining us. I can see we have some people in the meeting and some on online. Very nice to see you all here. So this is a quick crash course with Johan and Michael. And we are gonna run through some Azure services and some basic good stuff to know about Azure. And hopefully you will be very well prepared for a future certification. So let's continue here. Just quickly tell you a little bit about Azure Skåne. It's a community, a meetup where you can join and learn, network, have fun, and there's no prior requirements or anything. Just join us and have fun. That's the main motto. If you can do anything cool with Azure, it's just a big plus. And we are currently a little bit over 800 members, and that's nice. Azure Skåne is it's us four here: Magnus, Robin, and me, and then Johan. And Johan is also online here.
Yes, hello everyone. So I'm Johan, and I worked about 25 years with data management and Microsoft technology. Worked for some small companies and some very large companies, and now I'm running my own consulting business. And I've been working with Azure since the very beginning.
Yeah, and maybe I should say some words about myself. I'm working at Avanade in Denmark, working mostly with the bigger enterprise clients. So it's a really interesting topic, going to cloud, and sometimes the challenges, mostly the challenges are not the technical parts. It's more the organizational structure, how you actually enable the possibilities. I'm a Microsoft MVP since last year, so that's also nice to have that insight into all the services that are coming. If we continue here, it would be very nice if you attend this training or a meetup. If you do anything on social media, use the hashtag Azure Skåne, Azure Skåne, it's in English. It's always nice to see. We monitor this hashtag, so it's great to see any interaction there. We want to thank Foo Café and Microsoft. They are regular sponsors when we can do these physical meetings, and sometimes we also do them in a more hybrid recording fashion at Foo Café. And yeah, when we can meet up physically again, they usually provide us with food and drinks also. So big thank you to the sponsors. And now for everyone that's joining here, you get a small present. It's also courtesy of Microsoft. It's a small blockchain-based badger collection that you can claim. And you can only do that for a short period of time. So please try to do that. You get the links in the chat, and you can also scan it here if you prefer that way. And this is a special winter edition that you will get this time. So collect them. Eventually, when we can meet up physically, you can, if you have a good collection, you might get some cool prizes. I actually got something sent home to me, so that was nice. And now we're launching something cool. We have a Discord server. So if the community, we kind of feel that we get disconnected from each other from time to time when we have these meetings. So this is a way for us to stay connected and share experiences, knowledges, tips, tricks. Eventually we'll be hosting like viewing parties, etc. So please join the Discord, and all the links, etc., that we have from these presentations, they will appear there. It's also set up that, for example, if you work with Azure, you get notifications in there about updates, about potential outages, etc. So it's a potential go-to place for you if you work with Azure and you want to stay connected with people that have some experience with it. And that's the presentation. Now I want to hand it over to you, Johan.
Thank you, Michael. So, yeah, let's start to talk about Azure and the big picture. So, Azure, it is literally available anywhere. Microsoft, they are now experimenting with Azure data centers at the bottom of the sea. And you can get an Azure center delivered almost anywhere in the world. And if that's not enough, you can even get Azure Center or Azure in space. And finally this year, we are getting Azure also in Sweden. So what is a public cloud? Well, this is a map of Azure, and you can see the Azure regions here. Each dot here is an Azure region, and anyone can use Azure in these regions. And that is why it's called a public cloud. But there are, of course, some exceptions. So some places here, they are special places that are not open to the public. For instance, the US Department of Defense. I guess they don't want to share the data center with other people, and they don't want their data to leave the US. But for most users, the public cloud is the cheapest and easiest way to use Azure. But there's also an offering from Azure, the Azure Private Cloud or Azure Stack. And this is very useful if you don't want to expose your data. And you can even run a private cloud disconnected from the internet. So the first option is something that's called Azure Stack Hub. And this is great because it supports really a lot of services, most of the Azure services. And it is very powerful. But as usual, you get what you pay for. So it is powerful, it requires quite powerful hardware, and therefore it is a bit of an investment to get this, mainly because of the hardware, of course. And it can run disconnected from the internet. And then there are other options. So there's one option that's called Azure Stack HCI, or Hyper-Converged Infrastructure. And that can run on your own hardware. So actually you can run it at home, like I am doing. So I am running it in my basement. And yeah, you just have to be a bit careful. You know, I have this problem with electricity in my house now that I'm running Azure. So make sure you have enough resources. And the main disadvantage of the HCI is that it can only run a very limited number of Azure services. Then there is Azure Stack Edge, which is a hardware solution. So this is hardware that can run Azure workloads like IoT and AI and containers that you created in Azure. And it is battery powered, and you can bring it in a backpack. So you can really use it out there on the field. So you get the Azure functionality in really remote places. So these are the private cloud options. But then you can also mix public cloud and private cloud. And then you get a hybrid cloud. And to make it easier and simpler to manage a hybrid cloud, there is something that's called Azure Arc. And Azure Arc can even manage things like virtual machines in other clouds. So it's a multi-cloud solution. So it can manage also machines that you have on-premise. It can manage Azure Stack, Azure Stack Edge, etc. So Azure Arc, that's I call it one place to rule them all. There are a couple of different cloud services. So first, there is something that we call infrastructure as a service, or IaaS. And the services available, it is virtual servers, networking and firewalls, and storage. And in this case, Microsoft, they are responsible for the physical servers, the physical network, physical storage, physical security and virtualization, and you are responsible for the rest. And this gives you maximum flexibility, but it also gives you the most work because you have still a lot of responsibility for updating and patching things. So the next level, that's called platform as a service. And then that's typically application services like web apps or APIs. It's databases, business intelligence services, big data services, etc. And with platform as a service, Microsoft take responsibility for operating systems, updating, upgrading, software updates, patches, security updates, and everything. So you are just responsible for the applications that are running on these platforms. So it gives you much less maintenance work, but also a bit less flexibility. And then finally, the highest level is called software as a service, and that's for hosted applications. So for instance, Office 365, that is fully managed by Microsoft. They take care of everything, just make sure it's running for you. But there's one more level, and that is called serverless. And serverless, I would say that's very similar to platform as a service, but you only pay per consumption. So Microsoft, they take care of all infrastructure, updates and everything, but you pay really per usage. So for example, for Azure Functions, you only pay every time an Azure function is executed. So if it's not executed, you pay 0. As I said earlier, Azure is divided in regions, and every region has at least 3 data centers that are connected together. And this gives redundancy. And redundancy is, of course, necessary for high availability. And they have a high-speed network between them, so they can, replicate data very, very fast. But some regions, they are even better than other regions because they have something that's called availability zones. And looking at the map, I think around half of the regions, they have these availability zones, and the other half, they don't have it. But the ones that have availability zones, they are extra redundant. So they have zones where each zone is in an independent location with independent power, independent cooling, and independent networking. And each availability zone has at least 1 data center. So there can actually be more than 1 data center in an availability zone, so you can have redundancy also inside the availability zone. And why is this important? Well, we can look at storage, for example. Storage, it could be locally redundant. And that means that Microsoft, they promise you that they always have 3 copies of your data. But if it's locally redundant, it could all be in the same location, basically. So if the power goes out or the network fails or whatever, you could lose access to your data. So the next level here, it's called zone redundancy. So that's an option you can pick when you create a storage service in Azure. It costs a little extra, but then your data is automatically replicated to all 3 availability zones. And that means that if one zone fails, or maybe if 2 zones fail, Well, still everything is running completely independent in the third availability zone. And this also applies to virtual machines. You can spread out virtual machines across different availability zones, and this is what can give you these really high SLA levels. Because it's not only about network failures or power outage. This is also about Microsoft, doing updates and patching and things. So to really get the high SLA levels, you need to use availability zones. But there's one limitation with availability zones, and that is they have to be pretty close to each other because data is replicated synchronously. So it has to be fast. And there's one disadvantage with this, and that is if some, big disaster happens, like an earthquake or whatever, then all availability zones, which are pretty close to each other still, they could be, they could go down at the same time. So this is not secure against big disasters. And that's why you have one more level here. That's called geo-redundancy. So you can have geo-redundant storage. And the way it works is that Azure has paired regions. And this is fixed pairing. So for instance, East US is always paired with West US. So that means if anything really bad will happen to East US, then it is West US that will take over. And if you have any services that are geo-redundant, that means that they have been replicating their data to, from East US to West US, and then West US will be available to take over. So that is the highest and most costly redundancy level that you can have in Azure. All right. So I promised to talk about top 7 Azure services. And picking my top favorite Azure services, that was an almost impossible task because there are so many great services. So this is just a very small list of the available services. There are always new great services coming all the time. And here's a link where you can check the latest. I mean, if you check this a month later, there will be new services available. I'm very sure about that. But I did my best to find 7 really good services. And number 1. Can you guess which service this is? This is something that you all have if you are using Azure. This is the Azure Active Directory. And it comes with your Azure subscription. So there's no way you can use Azure without it. And it comes first, you can get it in a free edition. But there are also other editions available, like the Office 365 edition, and then there are premium editions. And the difference between them, that's the security options. So for instance, you have this 2-factor authentication that is available in the premium editions. So that can definitely be worth looking into. And this is not only for managing users and user permissions in Azure. This is also for managing service identities, and also computers and devices can join an Azure Active Directory. And why is this important that you can have this for service identities? Well, that is the best and preferred way to manage security between the things you build in Azure. So for instance, if you build a web application, you assign it a service identity, and then you can control what kind of access it has to other resources like SQL databases. And actually, a web app that you build in Azure can have access to the Azure Management API itself and do things. So, and everything here is controlled by Azure Active Directory. So if you work with Azure, you really should learn Azure Active Directory. Next one. What do you think this is? Well, this is Azure Virtual Networks, and it may not sound like the sexiest thing really, but it is very important, especially for security. So I say that you should always connect your Azure resources through your own private virtual networks instead of, using the public internet. This is very important for security. And basically, you can do anything with the Azure Virtual Network that you could do with hardware. You can add firewalls, something called network security groups, and this Michael will talk about this later. You can set up the routing and everything, and you can set up a VPN connection to your on-premise network. So there's site-to-site VPN, point-to-site, and the absolutely best one, that's the Azure Express route. So the Express route, that's your own private connection to an Azure data center. And that gives you absolutely the best speed and security. But that is, of course, also, that's the most costly option. But remember, always use Azure Virtual Networks for your resources, so you can manage the security. Okay, so what is this? I would say it has never been easier to deploy web apps than today. This is the Azure App Services. And I have had web apps running for years and years. And I haven't had to do any maintenance at all. It just kept running and running because it's so stable. And you can deploy web apps running on the most important platforms. And if your special stuff is not supported directly from the box here, you can still deploy it if you can just, package it as a container. So basically you can run anything here. And it counts with automatic scaling, high availability, continuous integration, continuous development, continuous deployment, remote debugging, etc. So it is a very useful service. And what could this be? Well, this is Azure Logic Apps. And I got started with Logic Apps when I needed to schedule jobs in Azure. So, for instance, you can use it to build intelligent monitoring solutions that not only just ping something, but also look into the result and can take different actions depending on the result. And it can also be triggered by things like incoming emails. It can read the email text and react to things and do different actions depending on, the sender, the content, text, and everything. It can react to things on Azure Service Bus, Event Hub, etc. So it's really a useful orchestrator. And maybe some of you have used the product. It was called Microsoft Flow and then renamed to Power Automate. And that is basically the same product, it's just another user interface. So Azure Logic Apps, that's the original and best. And it comes with many ready-made connectors for systems like SAP and similar, and it has our Outlook email connector. And it is low code, which means that even for not super technical users, it is still easy to use it. So I really can recommend this service. Next one. Yeah, you may recognize the language. This is, of course, SQL, so it's the Azure SQL Database. And SQL databases, that is, I would say, one of the absolutely most common ways to store data. It's been around for many decades since it was invented. And with Azure SQL Database, basically you get a database administrator as a service, so that supports you. So it's powered. So they will automatically take care of, automatic updates and backups, etc. It even does performance tuning for you. So it has an AI-powered performance tuning service built in, and it has intelligent threat protection, it's called. So all of these are things that you get with the Azure SQL Database automatically. And you always get the latest version. And you even get versions, and you get features before they appear in the on-premises SQL server. So it is ahead of the on-premise version. And it's very easy to scale it to, you can build jobs that monitor the current load and automatically scale it up and down. And you can actually run it also in serverless mode. So highly recommended. Okay, number 6. Which service could this be? This is Azure Data Factory, which is a bit similar to SQL Server Integration Services, or SSIS as it's called. So if you work with that, you understand what kind of tool this is. It's called an ETL tool, which stands for Extract, Transform, Load. And it can read data from almost any source. It can transform the data, and it can write the data to a destination. And it supports a lot of different data sources, as I said. So you can read from a REST API and write it to Azure Synapse if you wish, or you can read from SQL Database and write to a data lake, or any combo in between here. And it can even connect to your on-premises data sources. You just need to install a local agent. And it also supports scheduling and monitoring, because with this kind of jobs, usually, you can be interested in scheduling them and running them each day or every hour or whatever. And monitoring is important. All of that is built in to Azure Data Factory, and it's pretty easy to use. Okay, time for the final service. So, can anyone guess which language this is? Does anyone recognize it? Well, this is called Azure Quantum, and the language is called Q#, which is Microsoft's new language for quantum computer programming. So, instead of a CPU, you use a QPU, which is quantum processing unit. And it's available. So you can actually just learn this language and start experimenting, and you can run your programs on a real quantum computer inside Azure that uses qubits instead of regular bits, and that's where the power comes from. So, you can't even imagine what you will be able to do with a quantum computer in the future. This one still has a limited number of qubits, but it's growing more and more powerful. And if you learn this, maybe it could lead to a whole new career. Okay, that was about the services. So let's talk about Azure Tools also. And here is a list of tools that I currently use. I don't use all of them daily, but it is tools that are very good to have available, and it is very good to know that these tools exist. And I think you are all familiar already with the first tool here, the Azure portal. So let's skip and go to the next one. An Azure Resource Manager. That is the way you really should manage your Azure resources. So here you can easily define your whole Azure environment, and you can redeploy it anytime. So you manage it as code. And you can create reusable templates here that have parameters and logic in them. And you can easily deploy it through the portal or through command line tools. So it enables source control of your whole Azure environment. And then you get 100% control of what you're running. It is also declarative, which means that if you make any changes or anything and just reply it, it will just apply your changes and nothing else. So that is very, very helpful. And I can recommend also that you look at something that is called Project Bicep. And this is a new syntax, a new way for authoring these resource management templates that will make it easier to write them. Still, it's the same functionality, so it's nothing new you can do here, but no, it's an easier way to write them. But the old syntax will still continue to work, of course. And if you have been around for a long time, I guess some of you have been around since this time and know what this is, or even recognize this. That was a great time when we used it. And then you know, of course, the power of command line tools. That was, before the mouse was invented. And there are a couple of really powerful and good command line tools available for Azure. And they are very important tools when you want to automate things. So the first one, that's the Azure CLI or command line interface. It works directly on Windows, Mac OS and Linux, and you can just bring it on a USB stick. And it is the easiest command line tool to use. It's very helpful, as you can see here. So you learn it very quickly. And it's designed so that you should have to write as little as possible. So it has very good default settings for things. So it's very handy tool to have. Then if you need to do some more advanced stuff and need more power, well, then there's PowerShell. And there's an Azure module that you can download in PowerShell. Just make sure you download the right module, because there are multiple modules here and they are not compatible with each other, so you can't have them installed in parallel. So you have to be careful there. So download the AZ model, that's the right one. And if you do this, I would say this module, you can do more from here than you can do from the Azure CLI. At least you can automate more because you have the full PowerShell language behind. So this is for more advanced scripting. And then there's one more tool, AZ Copy. That's the tool to upload and download files to Azure storage. And it can also copy files, blobs and everything between storage accounts. And this, again, this works directly on Windows, Mac OS and Linux. So it's an easy way, you might just want to take a backup of your storage account in Azure or whatever. This is very useful. But not everybody wants to work with the command line tools all the time. So there are some tools with graphic user interfaces also. And let's have a look at them. So there is Azure Data Studio, which is a cross-platform database tool. And it has a modern editor that works with IntelliSense and everything. And it comes with a real bunch of useful plugins like Schema Compare between databases, Profiler that works also with Azure databases, machine learning stuff, a lot of plugins, and also community plugins that people have written. So it's very good. And it supports running Jupyter notebooks for AI. It is a very good tool to have, and it works with on-premises databases as well. So it's not only for Azure. And then there's Azure Storage Explorer. And I would say this is similar to Azure Copy, the command line tool, but here you have a user interface, a graphical user interface. So this is also for uploading and downloading files to Azure. You can also access virtual machine disks from here, and you can manage security and access to your storage easily from here. And it also allows you to access Cosmos DB databases. So yeah, it is a very handy tool to have available. And finally, let's talk about Cloud Shell. I don't know if you have seen it already, but in the portal there is this fantastic button. So directly in your web browser, without any installation or anything, you have access to the command line tools. So you just click this button here, and in the web browser you will get a terminal window where you can run Azure PowerShell, you can run Azure CLI and Azure Copy, and you can run this on any computer. So if you don't have your own computer and maybe you just have a mobile phone, you can do anything from here. So this is great, and you even have a Linux bash shell available in the Cloud Shell. So that's my favorite tools. Now it's time for Michael to talk about Azure security.
Yes, thank you for that rundown, Johan. So now we're gonna shift a little bit and start talking about some security, networking features, tools, and services around that. So as you know, if you're gonna move anything to cloud, security is probably one of the biggest hurdles. It was one of the biggest hurdles in the early days. Today, it's one of the biggest reasons why people move to cloud, because there are many good security features. But here we're just gonna quickly talk about some of the practices that you would use when you move your stuff to cloud. And in this illustration here, we talk about segmentation. And here we look at subscriptions. So you would segment your cloud estate with subscriptions, meaning you could have one subscription per application, one subscription per cost center, one subscription per region, or multiple subscriptions for same use cases. And you would isolate the services within that. And that could also be your security boundary, so you wouldn't connect these subscriptions unless needed. Within the subscriptions, you would have virtual networks. And you could have multiple virtual networks within a subscription. I'm going to touch a little bit more about networks in details in the next slides. So in each network, you could have multiple subnets. And these subnets, you could apply network security groups on. So network security groups would be a good feature to enable. It's like an access control list where you allow and deny access through the network on port level from IP addresses, etc., from ranges. Application security group is in similar fashion, but where you group them per application. And SQL is a good example here. So you would define a policy, and you would tag that with SQL tag, and then under that you would say that all my SQLs would have these rules. And of course, you could have additional firewall enabled. Usually when companies move their estate to cloud, they want to be able to control their firewall and the security setup. So they implement network virtual appliances, which basically are virtual installations of a firewall that they usually use, like F5 or Palo Alto or similar. Azure has their own firewall service, and it's a level 7 compatible one that you can put the rules with allow and deny and so on. If we then touch a little bit deeper on the virtual networks, so a virtual network, it's actually pretty cool because it's a virtual layer that you can deploy how many you like, and it's free. There's no cost around it, but it enables you to build your platform, your solution. In my illustration here, I have deployed 2 big 16 networks, side ranges, with 65,000 plus addresses. And I have 2 of them. And as you can see, I also get a warning there that you have something that will overlap with this. And usually this is a common mistake when you start with putting stuff in Azure or in a general cloud, that you just use the default settings and you get a network. Eventually you have 5 of them and they are all in the same range, and then you want to connect the services and then you have IP conflicts. So it's a really nice addition, this small warning that they have enabled here. I underline that subscription and region is the range for your virtual network. So you can't have a virtual network that goes cross subscriptions or over regions. So I can have a virtual network that I deploy in West Europe and also has a footprint in North Europe. If you want to do that, you have to connect them with peerings or other mechanisms. Under each virtual network, I would have subnets. So the subnets here are an additional layer of segmentation that you can have. So usually you have a big CIDR range, and then you put, for example, my database subnet or my virtual hub subnet. Well, basically you wouldn't have the virtual hub in a subnet, but you get the picture. It's a segmentation level that you can have. And something I also want to point out here is the service endpoint. You have 3 options to secure it even more, and they are very similar in naming. So there's something called service endpoint, you have private endpoint, and then you have something called private link. And they are a bit different, but the goal is the same, to keep you more secure. So service endpoints is something that you can enable here, and as you can see, I've broken out, or actually expanded the list of the services here. So a service endpoint in this case is that I enable my virtual network to speak with services, for example, Key Vault, so Microsoft Azure Key Vaults. So that would be the service, and what that means is I do not communicate with that service over public endpoints. I do it on the Microsoft Azure backbone. I still have a public endpoint, and in enterprises that's usually an issue, but let's not talk about that this time. If you have several networks, you probably want to connect them together, and you can do that with peering, so you can set up gateways or VPNs. So in my illustration here, I just have 3 virtual networks that I connect with peerings. One common thing here, mistake here, is that usually is forgotten, is that these connections are non-transitive, which means if my A network want to speak with my C network, that's not possible if I have it peered like this. So in that case, I would need to add an additional peering here. Something that's also good to know is there's a concept called user-defined routes, and within the services, it's called system routes. That's heavily used when you would, if you have a firewall and you want to say that everything that goes out of this network needs to pass the firewall so we can inspect the traffic or filter it. Then you say that within my subnet or within my subnet, everything needs to go to this IP address. That's the next hop destination. So just to put everything into context, this would be a really standard setup today, where you have an on-premise footprint. You have a VPN connection up to a hub virtual network. This hub virtual network would be something a company would set up that only addresses the network tasks that you would have, and from there you connect to whatever solution you have. So the spoke virtual networks here could be a specific application, or it could be a regional office that has some solutions running, etc. And just to showcase that these green lines in the middle here that goes to the firewall, that would be a user-defined route. Please also make a note of this as an Azure Bastion, because I will cover that in the next slide here. On top of this, you could have something called application gateway. And in that application gateway, you can enable web application firewall. This is a really good tool also. On the application gateway, you could even have OWASP scanning. That's an additional security feature. So it's a very capable system, but it's an additional service that you have to enable. You can combine this with firewall also. So the Bastion I mentioned, that's basically a JumpHost as a service. Usually you want to isolate a network or a solution that you have, and then in that network you need to access it somehow. Then you would have probably a Citrix or some other solution, so you would be able to get in there. Now, JumpHost is a common concept, and in this case, Microsoft offers it as a service that you can enable, and then you connect to it via the portal, and then you have a connection into your network. One limitation today is that you have to have a Bastion host per network. And when you create the virtual network, you have these options if you go through the portal and deploy them. You also have something called the DDoS protection, denial of service. And that is something that's natively enabled in some degree in Azure, on all Azure services, because they want to provide some security to you, so you wouldn't, get overloaded from start. And there's levels to that service. There's a paid option also where you can manage it in more granular level on the network level. So some additional features, tools, and services regarding security. Azure Key Vault. It probably speaks by itself. It's a vault where you keep your keys, your secrets, your certificates, etc. And you can enable your services or applications to fetch whatever secret or key that they need from that Azure Key Vault. And there's it's a nice central place where you can keep all of your secrets. Then there's something called the Azure Security Center. And this is also something that Microsoft, with their scale, is able to do. So they have built a service that kind of runs through all of your security setups that you have. Can also have some AI logic behind it, where it gives you recommendations and looking towards baselines, and then you get a really good graphical view of what you need to step up on. It could look something like this. You get a secure score, and if you work with Office 365, you recognize this. You have a similar setup there. It tells you that something is needs to be fixed, and then you have additional recommendations. Some of these recommendations are naturally tied to services that you need to enable that would, cost more, but that's something that you have to decide by yourself. So that's why it's just recommendation and it's not enabled by default. You would also get a good list of these services that are not living up to the standards, and there's a weighting on those services, what would give most benefit or up your score most if you fix that. So Azure Security Center is a really good thing to have, and luckily you have a free tier, of course, and that's what's called Azure Security Center. And actually, if you pay for it, then it's called Azure Defender, and it's more to keep the wording, the naming aligned with all the other threat detection defender tools out there. And it's good to know that this exists, and if you want to have it more secure, you should use the Defender one. So that was the network security features and tools part. So let's talk about some identity. I kind of harshly named it Legacy AD here. And what is that? Well, that's just something that marketing somewhere down the line threw out and called the AD that's currently widely used legacy, because it can't actually provide all of the features that Azure AD does. But technically, Azure AD is not an AD in the same sense yet, but they're working towards it. So what can Azure AD do then? Well, Microsoft puts it as identity as a service, and this is actually a really key feature that Microsoft has, this identity part, because it ties into the whole ecosystem they have with all the Office 365, M365 deployments out there. If we look at some of the cool things it can do, conditional access. So if you have an Azure AD account, you can configure something called conditional access, that you have to meet certain requirements or live up to certain conditions for you to be able to be allowed access into the system. So the most commonly described use case is that if I would be in Malmö, Sweden, where I am now, log into my corporate account, and then in 10 minutes I would do the same from Miami, which would be really nice, but not possible. The conditional access would highlight that and say, this doesn't look good. So you have to, I'm going to challenge you with something extra. So that's a really nice feature. There's single sign-on across cloud solutions. There's an explanation coming in the next slide, but basically it's easier to enable single sign-on across different services or solutions you have if you have Azure AD. Self-service password reset, if you're going to do that on the traditional AD, you have to build up services. Now it's just a check mark. You have the business to business and business to consumer option to enable. You basically create an additional AD and you hook those services together, and you can control accounts and you can provide account creation for any user that would want to use your service. So B2B and B2C is growing and it's getting bigger within this realm. And there's tons of other services that Azure AD provides. So just to use a Microsoft illustration here, what you would regularly do today is you would use your current estate of your catalog service, your AD, and you would connect it to Azure AD with something called AD Connect, Azure AD Connect. So you could still, create your users in the regular way you do today. You probably have a service running or a HR workflow that creates new users. Those would then get synced up to Azure AD. You would have your security groups and all other security settings on your Azure AD, and those would also get synced up to Azure Active Directory. But here you also can enable the other third-party cloud provider services, and you have the whole ecosystem of Microsoft, and you would use Azure Active Directory for your mobile device management, your Intune deployment, etc. You can register devices into the cloud and so on. So it's a really big feature Microsoft has here that differentiates them towards the other cloud providers. So that's maybe why they would call it legacy AD. But let's not coin that anymore. So from Microsoft, from an Azure perspective, you would use Azure AD to use your role-based access control. So now it's a little small picture here, but all the resources in Azure, if you have a resource group or a management group, etc., you would use role-based access control on those, and you have to have an Azure AD to do that, which kind of ties into if you're going to do any governance in cloud. So here we discuss how you would govern the cloud. So you would probably segment your estate with subscriptions. And one common issue some years ago was that now I have 15 subscriptions, and if I'm going to do any management in them, I have to go into each of them, and eventually the security posture I have given people access in that subscription, they should have access in that subscription, and I have security groups, etc. It's basically the regular AD security sprawl. But then Microsoft looked at AVS and came up with management groups. And management groups is a level above subscriptions where you can do all your policies and security postures, and then you can put a hierarchy, push it down, so it gets easier to manage. But it would be that you would have a management group that pushes down on security groups, and then from security, from subscriptions, and then from subscriptions you would come into resource groups, and from resource groups you would go to services. And you would have to have that in place to be able to govern the cloud effectively. Or in addition to that is tags. So every service will benefit from having a tag. With tags, you can do cool stuff to like get out reports about usage. You can control, not control, but you would be able to track cost. You can set up cost management on resource group. You could put some budgets on them so you get alerted when a resource group would go over a certain budget that you would have set. And tags is a really effective way for you to actually track down everything that happens in your cloud. And tags would look something like that. It's a bad picture, I'm sorry for that, but you could have tags for cost centers, for projects, for applications. You could have an application called e-commerce, and then you would have dev, test, production. You could filter then on dev, test, or production and see what kind of cost that drives. If you don't have that already in different subscriptions, but then within that subscription, you probably have multiple dev or test or production applications. Azure Advisor is another cool service that Microsoft provides, and it's a free of charge thing. You could look at it as your personal cloud consultant telling you what you should improve or do different. Very much the experience is very like Azure Security Center. Sorry for the small pictures again, but here you would be able to see then I have some cost savings, I have some security stuff I need to fix, I have some availability stuff that I can improve if I want to have it really high available, and so on. And this advisor keeps running and doing, checking, scanning your environments and giving you all of this free of charge advisory. Again, some of the recommendations are to enable services that would eventually cost some money for you, but it's all, again, up to you to act on it. But you would get a good recommendation here. Policy. It's probably one of the most powerful tools for you to use. Azure Policy. If you work in IT, you probably know what a policy can do in Active Directory sense. In some cases, it's the same concept here. I define a policy, I apply it to my subscription, to my management group. In that case, it would go to many subscriptions. And then that policy would be telling how you basically what you would be able to do within that state. So here you can see that there are many built-in policies. For example, the example I'm showing here is on backup. Imagine that you open your subscription for your dev subscription, and you allow people to roam free and deploy services there. And eventually someone will deploy a service that breaks, and they didn't think about this and that, etc. You take learnings from that, and then you would basically say that no virtual machines with this tag is allowed to be deployed without having backup enabled. Then me as a user or developer would be able to deploy my virtual machine. I would probably get an error message telling me, yeah, you must have backup enabled. Or there's an audit that tells someone that, yeah, now there's 5 machines with no backup. Someone should do something about it. And it kind of gives you the power to act against cloud sprawl. And cloud sprawl is something that, in an ideal world, you would just set the frame for your cloud for your Azure subscription, meaning the security is correct, all my policies are in place, and then you would just open the door and let the developers do whatever they can, and they wouldn't be able to break anything because I'm controlling all the policies within that. That's the ultimate goal. And then the last thing is the compliance. It's a shared responsibility if you're going to be compliant, depending on what industry you're working within. It's still a shared responsibility. And here again, policy is your best friend. Here I have highlighted some policy definitions. That's a group of policies. So for example, if I would have a healthcare service in UK, I would probably have the NHS requirement on me. Here we have a definition for 59 policies that I need to have in place to actually be regular, to have the compliance setting, to be compliant, basically. And it's fantastic that you have all of these policies defined, and you just piece them together, or you just take one definition and you deploy it. But it's still up to you to fulfill all of these. Just because you can't say that I had a policy that Microsoft provided or definition Microsoft provided, and is that enough? No, it's not. It's a shared responsibility. You still have to follow up to be compliant. So yeah, you don't you have to do some work to be compliant. So now we're coming to the last part of it. What am I paying for, and how do I get refunds for cloud downtime? Because downtime happens. And the quick answer is that, yeah, you have to look that up. There's something called composite SLA, so service level agreement. But depending on the services you have, you could put together a solution using 5 services. Those services have different SLAs, so you have to multiply that together. And then if those services are built in one region and you don't have a region failover, then there's a different SLA if you do have that. So you still have to do some calculations, and this is a basic example of that. I have a SQL database with 4 nines, and I have an app service with 3 nines and a 5, and together it gives me 3 nines and a 4. And you probably ask yourself, what does that mean? And this is a good table to be acquainted with. So if I would have 4 nines, it means that in a year that I have 52 minutes of downtime. If I have 4 nines, like it's here, then it's a bit higher, so to say. So it's good to know what that means, and then you say, okay, Microsoft messed up. All of these services were down for a week. I lost millions of dollars. What do I get back? Basically, you get back the service credits that you lost, and that's leave it to take it. So with that in mind, you probably say, I need to have a cloud strategy. And that's a common conception today, that if you have it in cloud doesn't mean that everything is golden. You still need to do your homework. And that was kind of my run. And if you are with us, Johan, I will ask you to wrap this up.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I would like to say that if you have been with us all this time, then we've been talking about the Azure core concepts like, public, private cloud, hybrid cloud, Azure Stack, and everything like that. We've described some of the most important services, some of the most important management tools, the security and network stuff, identity governance, and cost management. So actually, this is really what you need to know to be able to take your first Azure certification. So why not, continue just completing the studying for the certification and take your first Azure certification? Because, with an Azure region opening up in Sweden, interest will grow really a lot. So it is a very good future job market. So we absolutely encourage you to continue learning and taking the certification. And we can also help you in the Discord. So here are some actions we recommend that you take. First of all, join our Discord. Here's a link. So that is your way to ask questions to us, because we can then answer the questions after this presentation. And that's your way to get in touch with us. And then there are these learning modules to take the certification, but we have summarized the most important things, so it will not be too much time you need to spend to be able to really take the certification. And then just book a time to complete it. And tell us that you've done this. We will celebrate with you. And with that, me and Michael, we are saying thank you so much, and we hope to see you later at another presentation. The next upcoming one will be on 9th of March. And then it will be about AI
democratizing.
Yes, a very hard word to pronounce. It will be about Azure AI and cognitive services. And then after 1 week after that, there will be another one about Azure security with Stefan Schörling. So we have these events upcoming. And if you haven't already joined our meetup, you really should do that. So you will get invitations to our events. We are now over 800 members. So we are one of the biggest meetups on Azure in the Nordic region. And you can follow us. You can follow us on Twitter for updates. You can visit our web pages here, where we, of course, will keep publishing stuff. So thank you very much for listening to us. And do you want to say any final words, Michael?
Yes, I could mention that if you're interested in Microsoft Realm, there's an Ignite coming up at the end of March. Registrations are open, so go out and sign up. And hopefully we see you in the next meetup we have. And again, join the Discord and connect with us and the rest of the people there.
Yeah, and don't forget to grab your Azure Learning badge. It's a limited edition, and you need to access it now because it expires. So you need visit that link and get your special badge. Thank you very much.
Thank you.